Hi, this is Gerg Kesich, the editorial page editor at the Portland Press Herald, and I'm here with Jim Fossel, our new Sunday columnist. This will be a new feature on the podcast. Greg talks to a Republican. I do have Republican friends that my mother pays them to talk to me, but Jim is joining us this week, and he's if the sound sounds a little funny, he's calling in from outside Portland. Where are you coming from, Jim? Is it Gardner? Gardner. Yeah. Okay. It's not because he doesn't have a visa to enter Portland, but he couldn't fit it into his schedule. So we're very happy that he called in. Just want to talk to you a little bit, Jim, about yourself and your politics, and also this week's column. Can you tell me sort of where you fit in the Republican universe?
Well, that's always a difficult question to answer, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially lately.
Right.
I think, like a lot of young Republicans, I'm more fiscally conservative and socially liberal.
How young are you?
35, not too young.
Well, you're pretty young, younger than me. So I'm 35. So you came of age in the Bush era?
Right. Basically, I was a freshman in college when 9/11 happened.
Okay. And do you associate yourself with any particular movements within? Are you consider yourself a conservative?
Yeah, and I would consider myself more of a traditional conservative than anything, except, as I said, with social issues, I tend to be more libertarian or liberal.
You say you're conservative on the fiscal side.
Yeah, on the fiscal side, and on national security issues and gun rights and immigration, I tend to be more conservative. But on social issues, I tend to be more sort of, I wouldn't say liberal, but more libertarian.
Okay. That's helpful. And this week, your first column, we're not writing about conservatives at all, right? You're giving advice to the people across the aisle.
Well, yes and no. I'm also sort of giving advice to my fellow Republicans who may not have supported Trump in the primary or the general. But yeah, I was focusing on Democrats and their reaction to Trump, and not to overreact, because that plays into his hand. That's exactly what he wants. They need to point out when he's wrong and disagree with him, and just like they would with any other president, and fight him when he's wrong, but not to overreact to everything that he does.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot of Democrats who are remembering how the Tea Party formed in the early days of the Obama administration, and seeing that as a viable model for a Democratic opposition party. Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, yes and no. I mean, first of all, I point out that the Tea Party actually really started when Bush was still president. A lot of the Tea Party movement began with opposition to the stimulus package, which Bush passed. Much of that was really an opposition to establishment politics in general, not just the other party. So in some ways, it's sort of more like the Bernie Sanders movement than it is like some of these protests that are happening. Because I remember I was taking calls for Senator Collins' office in Augusta when the stimulus was being passed, and there were a lot of angry conservatives calling our office and letting her know how they felt.
That's interesting, right? Susan Collins has really seen the wheel come around, because now she's getting calls from angry liberals.
And probably angry conservatives still, too, I imagine.
Probably. There's probably a few that still know her number. But it's judging from the letters to the editor, I used to get a lot of anti-Susan Collins letters from conservatives, and now I get them from liberals.
Yeah, it seems like she's been the focus more of liberal ire lately. Probably supporting Senator Sessions' help, for the reason that she's getting less attention from conservatives for now. But I suspect as the administration goes on, that'll go back the other way again.
But to the Democrats, you make an interesting point in the column that they have not been listening to the working class voters and middle class voters. And I wonder, could you expound on that a little? What do you mean by that? And if they had been listening, what would they have heard?
Well, I think this is something that not just the Democrats, both parties haven't been good at until recently. Trump has been better at it lately, for better and for worse, but neither party, for example, has done a good job explaining the benefits of free trade and why it's a good idea, rather than just passing it and getting it done and then justifying it after the fact. In this case, it caught up with the Democrats, but it could just as easily have caught up with the Republicans, since that was a position that many people in both parties supported for many years. Just the timing this time worked out against the Democrats. But the problem with free trade and a number of these policies is that there's a consensus around them, the people in government, but they don't bother to explain why there is that consensus.
So do you think it's more a matter of messaging than there's something wrong with the policy?
I think it is mainly a problem with messaging. I think there are certain specific areas where the policy could be better as well, but that starts to get into the weeds pretty quickly. I think the biggest problem is explaining that it's easy to say that free trade costs jobs, but it's a lot harder to explain the reasons, the more complex reasons behind job losses in certain areas, like the manufacturing sector losing jobs because of the advances in technology, not just because of free trade. It's a lot easier to just blame it on free trade and not consider the fact that, for example, people don't buy as many papers anymore because we have iPads, as you will know.
Yes, that's the one that keeps me awake at night. But it's true that technology is changing everything when people talk about bringing the plants back. Well, or the statistic that I always think of is that we produce as much paper as we ever did in Maine, but with a fraction of the number of people. And the
other thing is that now we have many more regulations on air quality and water quality and all these things that we didn't have 30, 40 years ago when the paper industry was going much stronger. And other countries still don't have those regulations. So it's only natural that a lot of manufacturing goes to the countries with fewer regulations and cheaper labor. But that would be happening probably with or without free trade. It would just be more or less legal.
Right. I wonder if you could take a minute and talk to me about the Republican Party in Maine. If this election had turned out slightly differently, I think there would be a lot of soul searching about National Republican Party, about whether it was broken, whether the coalitions that came together for Reagan and Bush you could still patch them together. And because of some surprise turnout in Michigan and a couple of other states, it went Republican, and now we're doing the soul searching about the Democrats. But could you talk a little bit about sort of the makeup of the Republican Party in Maine, and what the different groups are and how they work together and where their tensions might be?
Yeah, well, I think there are a number of different groups, and in some ways, I've always considered myself parts of all of them. There are the traditional Republicans in Maine, the sort of generally more socially moderate but fiscally conservative Republicans like Senator Collins. Mm-hmm. And then there are the more socially conservative Republicans like Governor LePage. And then there are other newer factions that have sprung up, like the more libertarian-oriented groups, many of whom were involved in passing the marijuana referendum last year.
Right.
And there's the Tea Party, which overlaps with but is separate from the libertarian faction. Now all these groups are being held together because we have the governorship and we had the state senate. But you're right, if Trump had lost and we came very close to losing the state senate, then things would be quite different now, both in Maine and across the country.
You say the libertarians are kind of overlap with the Tea Party, but they're not the same thing?
Right. I mean, the Tea Party is sort of, I've always used it to describe more people who were newly interested in politics than describe any particular ideology. That's interesting. Brought in a lot of people, some of whom are moderate, some of whom are more traditional social and fiscal conservatives, and some of whom are more libertarian. But the people that I've seen at the local level that have been brought in by the Tea Party movement have been all over the map. It's not really an ideology per se, the same way that some of the other groups are. It can really be scattershot, just almost like a party unto itself. And now that started to happen within the Democratic Party with Bernie Sanders in the primary this past year.
Right. I mean, there was a lot of energy around Bernie Sanders, and there is now a question of how to integrate them into a bigger party. And as you've noted and others have noted, there's some tensions around that.
Right. I mean, it's almost as much about just a distrust between the grassroots and what people like to label as the establishment, as it is as much between any ideological dispute.
Right.
I mean, many of the people who ended up becoming leaders of the the Tea Party movement were actually pretty established politicians already at the time that it began. They just took advantage of the moment, like Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio.
Sure.
And the same thing I expect will happen amongst the Democrats as they try to come to grips with the split that they're dealing with.
Well,
There'll be people who will take advantage, not take advantage of their supporters, but take advantage of the moment, the enthusiasm, the energy, and tie themselves to that group. Like, for example, the congressman from Minnesota who ran for DNC chair.
Right, Keith Ellison.
Yeah, Keith Ellison, thank you. Who was already a congressman, so obviously, you can argue that he's as much a part of the establishment as anybody. In fact, you can argue that Bernie Sanders is part of the establishment.
Right.
He's been in Congress for 20 years. But at the same time, they're inspiring people who've never been involved in politics before to get involved the same way that Ron Paul did.
Right.
So I think it's a very similar situation that the Democrats will find themselves in over the next couple of years that the Republicans were in at first in the beginning of the Obama administration. The difference is that I think that for Trump to win, he had to pull in more Democrats than people realize. The national exit polls and studies show that there were a large number of voters who voted for Obama twice, who then voted for Trump.
Does that tell you?
Obviously, people are not racist. They're not isolationists. They're not crazy. They gave up on the Democratic Party, and they gave up on the Democratic Party for a reason, not just because they were narrow-minded. It was because they had real trouble with a candidate, and they had real trouble with that candidate 8 years ago. That's why they didn't vote for the first time.
Yeah. So Trump had a very different message than the last two Republican nominees, and he, as you say, attracted voters that voted against the last two. Is this signal a change in what Republicans stand for?
It may. I mean, I would tend to hope not, because I tend to disagree with a number of his populist themes on some issues. For example, I tend to support free trade, and I tend to not be a fan of simplistic explanations or solutions for problems. But it would be better, regardless of whether they stood on the actual issues, if all kinds of politicians got better at explaining their positions rather than just taking them. And hopefully somebody else besides Trump can do that in a better way than he has in both parties.
Yeah.
Well, hey, I'm going to let you go, but this has been really interesting. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to seeing your work and having a chance to chat with you some more.
Thanks. I mean, it'll be interesting. As I said in the column this week, I think everybody needs to give Trump a chance to actually perform, and if he does a good job, then that's in the end going to be good for everybody. But if he continues to divide the country, as I think Obama did when he was president, then that's going to open up an opportunity for everybody for the other side. So hopefully he gets things together and can bring us together, but we'll see.
I can tell we're going to have a lot to talk about. Okay. Thanks, Jim.
There always is. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks for listening to the Portland Press Herald podcast. Make sure you never miss a podcast episode by subscribing on iTunes or your favorite podcast aggregator. For more of our podcasts, visit pressherald.com/podcasts. Follow the link there to this episode to leave a comment. You can also leave a comment on our Facebook page. I'm Chad Gilley. Once again, thank you for listening to the Portland Press Herald podcast.